Okay, this is the session on permanent revolution. I welcome you back. The speaker for the ICL will be Mili, who is a member of the International Executive Committee of the ICL. The speaker for the LFI will be Norden, who was a longtime editor of Workers' Vanguard, and of course now is affiliated with the IG of the LFI. And the coin toss has been won by the CIL, so Mili will go first.
I want to be clear about something. This debate is not a historical review of permanent revolution, but an inseparable part of the struggle to forge the Fourth International today. The fundamental question in relation to the nations of the world oppressed by the imperialist bourgeoisie is that the only solution in order to bring national and social emancipation is workers' revolution. And the only way this can be achieved is by forging communist parties to be able to lead the struggle to success. I think posing the question in this way, both organizations can claim some form of agreement. But for Marxists, the question is not just preaching revolution. What is fundamental is how a workers' revolution will be achieved. What are the tasks of the revolutionaries in the oppressed world, as well as the imperialist countries, to advance this struggle, starting from day-to-day struggles and connecting them to the ultimate goal. For this to happen, the proletarian vanguard must put at the epicenter of the strategy the struggle for national liberation of the oppressed nations from world imperialism, and not skip over the just national aspiration of the masses, ignoring them or even denounce them as an obstacle to revolutionary class struggle and socialist revolution. And here lies our difference with the LFI. So the focus in this presentation is going to be precisely that: how to advance the struggle for the socialist revolution in the neo-colonial world. This one. To understand why the fight for national liberation is the motor force for revolution in an oppressed country, it is crucial to understand the material reality in these countries. So let me give you a picture of where I come from. Greece fought against the Ottoman Empire to establish an independent state, only to find itself under the yoke of three protecting powers. The War of Independence brought the Greek people not freedom, but the dictatorial rule of Bavarian princes imposed by the British, French, and Russian ruling classes. In an astonishing irony with the Troika of our day, an international finance commission took charge and controlled Greek finances, stripped Greece of its sovereign powers. One financial bankruptcy followed the other, and really very little remained for the masses. In World War I, the imperialists blockaded Athens, starving the population, forcing Greece to enter the war. World War II, the country was occupied by three forces: Italy, Germany, Bulgaria. The Nazi occupation was amongst the most brutal in Europe. When the Nazis left, the British first and then the US took over, crashing the revolution. In 1967, a military dictatorship backed by the US reigned the country for 7 years. And in our epoch, the epoch of the hegemony of the US, the main hegemonic power, together with Germany, strangled the country through the peaceful, the liberal, the peaceful plunder of finance capital. The workers have fought tooth and nail against the imperialists. From 2008 to 2015, endless general strikes, massive, militant, the masses directly confronted the imperialists and their Greek lackeys, demanding their liberation from imperialist bondage. The latest example, after a train crash last February caused by the destruction of the railways by privatization, 57 people died, and a mass political strike took place against the imperialists and the government. From privatization of education, health, ports, closing of industry, attacks on government rights, overthrowing the government, to a huge debt on the shoulders of the masses, the imperialists dictate and control every aspect of the political and economic life of the country, keeping it poor and undeveloped in a state of destitution. This is how the material reality of Greece looks like. and taking into consideration whatever differences in every country, this is the living picture for all the neo-colonial world. Grounding our method in this materialist understanding, it's not hard to identify that the main enemy of the proletariat in oppressed nations is imperialism and not the national bourgeoisie. This is illustrated clearly in the struggles of the proletariat. Historically, class struggle in Greece is defined and pushed forward by the struggles of the proletariat and the broader masses of the oppressed against imperialist subjugation. It is this oppression and national humiliation that moves the masses. Their just national aspiration, their powerful anti-imperialist sentiment, their yearning for peace and a better life against the humiliation imposed by the imperialists gives the proletariat struggles for the most basic demands an explosive character and are powerful weapons which need to be taken up by the proletarian vanguard to defeat imperialism and bring national and social liberation for the masses. Trotsky wrote, quote, "To really arouse the workers and peasants against imperialism is possible only by connecting their basic and most profound life interests with the cause of the country's liberation." But in its struggle for its liberation, there is an obstacle, the national bourgeoisie. To understand its role, why and how is an obstacle, it is necessary to show its material position. This is determined by combined and uneven development. The decisive forces in oppressed countries are the imperialists and the proletariat, not the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is standing weak and trapped between the two, incapable of playing an independent role, and forced to maneuver between the two. Seeking to resolve the democratic questions and develop the country to strengthen its position as a ruling class, it has to rely either on the imperialists or on the proletariat to resist against the imperialists. It is in the latter within bourgeoisie can take progressive measures like nationalizations that promotes the illusion that it can lead the struggle against imperialist subjugation. At the same time, as a property class, it's conscious that any independent struggle of the proletariat against the imperialists threatens its own class rule. This is why it has to maintain itself at the head of the national liberation struggle. Because of its ties to private property, in order to secure its class interests, at the end it suppresses the proletariat, betrays the anti-imperialist struggle, and sides with the imperialists. Only based on this method, it is possible to show why the bourgeoisie is a reactionary class and why the proletariat is the only class capable of liberating the nation from imperialism, resolving the democratic tasks under the dictatorship of the proletariat supported by the peasantry. The national bourgeoisie is the main political obstacle, but not the main force to defeat. In response to the bourgeoisie, two non-revolutionary poles in the workers' movement have developed historically in Greece and in the world. One consists in supporting the bourgeoisie under the pretext of fighting against imperialism. This trend views the bourgeoisie as the force that can bring freedom to the oppressed people, reflecting the right-wing expression of opportunism. A good example is the Greek Stalinists, which in the 40s, in the name of fighting fascism, betrayed the heroic struggle of the workers and peasants, subordinating them to the Greek bourgeoisie and the progressive, in quotes, imperialists. The other pole is a reaction to the first, in this side of the room, and with the correct impulse of fighting against the national bourgeoisie, rejects the anti-imperialist struggle altogether under the pretext of class independence. This is the expression of left-wing opportunism, sectarianism. A good example is the Greek Trotskyists in the 40s, which in the name of pure class struggle and socialist revolution denied any kind of national oppression. Ironically, today, they took flip positions. The Trotskyists support the national bourgeoisie under the pretext of fighting imperialism, and the Stalinists reject the anti-imperialist struggle in the name of class independence. Both trends are an obstacle of forging a Marxist pole in the neo-colonies, and as two sides of the same coin, both end up leaving the national liberation struggle and the leadership of the masses in the hands of the national bourgeoisie. Both poles strengthen the grip of the nationalists on the masses, betraying both the national and social emancipation. What is the only revolutionary policy for the neocolonies is a Marxist pole in that room, which fights for the national liberation of the oppressed people of the world, armed with the Leninist principle of class independence, is the only way to smash the nationalists, take the lead, and direct the anti-imperialist struggle to its final conclusion. Workers' revolution. I want to insist, the only way to break the hold on the masses is to compete with the national bourgeoisie. This is not a new program invented by the ICL, comrades. It's an application of the Comintern's second and fourth congresses. I challenge the LFI to prove that the Comintern's program, which generalized the experience of the October Revolution, was class collaborationist and publicly condemned. The thesis on the Eastern question is in the lead table, and everybody should read it carefully and make your conclusions. The LFI falls into the second pole of the two trends described above. It doesn't deny that the neo-colonial world is oppressed by imperialism, but this only speaks against it. Recognizing the oppression by imperialism and even having orthodox formulation against it, in a sense, is more deceitful, since it masks its opportunism with left formulas, like preaching class struggle and revolution. However, what you will not find is how you will make one. Both organizations agree that it is essential to combat nationalism. The question is how? We see the national aspiration of the masses as the motor force, as the heart of the revolution, which must be channeled and pushed forward through the revolutionary veins of the proletarian vanguard and beat harder, sweeping away the arteriosclerotic and diseased body of capitalism. The LFI see the national aspiration of the masses as something that needs to be suppressed, held back, or even dropped, clogging the arteries, stopping the heart of the revolution, depriving it of every breath. This is our difference. By rejecting the force which moves the millions of oppressed into class struggle and ultimately socialist revolution, the LFI capitulates to the same force that it wants to combat, the nationalists, leaving the anti-imperialist struggle in their hands. The LFI creates a false dilemma by contrasting the struggle against imperialist subjugation and the struggle for the overthrow of national bourgeoisie. But every struggle that arouses the proletariat against the imperialists is a real step forward on the road to social liberation. The revolutionary struggle to break the imperialist yoke does not weaken, but rather strengthens the political differentiation of classes. When the exploited masses stand on their feet confronting the imperialists, it inevitably pushes the national bourgeoisie into an open block with the latter. To fight against imperialism, one must necessarily fight against the national bourgeoisie. The essence of permanent revolution and the tasks of communists consist not in rejecting the masses' aspirations, neither in the separation of class struggle and democratic demands, but in the fusion of the democratic and socialist struggles under the communist banner. This is the epitome of the transitional program, the bridge or the stages of the revolutionary class struggle. But let's apply LFI's method in the US. By this approach, class struggle rather than democratic demands, the black masses should drop their struggle for black liberation and fight only against their class oppression. But we all know, including the LFI, that you cannot even start to talk about class struggle in the US in separation with the struggle for black liberation. The fight for black liberation is inseparable from the struggle for workers' revolution in the US. Taking this back to the neocolonies, the fight for national liberation is inseparable from the struggle for workers' revolution. But no, for the LFI, that is a capitulation to nationalism. What does the LFI's position mean for the proletariat and the imperialist centers? The task for communism in the US is to champion the national liberation struggles of the oppressed people. Only if the proletariat of the West fight for this principle will manage to break the mistrusts of the workers of the oppressed world and open the road for the revolutionary unity of the world proletariat. The LFI's position divides the world proletariat because it is not rallying the oppressed people to fight against imperialist enslavement, but tells them to temper their national aspirations. With this, any talk of building an international that fights imperialism is a fraud. The LFI's program, and I'm very happy you talked about the Anti-Imperialist United Front, came into practice during the Greek referendum in 2015. Brutal austerity by the EU, IMF, had impoverished the masses for years. The imperialists were pushing for more austerity. The masses were fighting back. Syriza, the leader party of the bourgeoisie in the government, was squeezed between the two and called for a referendum. The question was simple: do you accept the austerity package of the EU, IMF, or not? Syriza hoped that the masses would vote yes, aiming to have a popular mandate for the new austerity package, capitulating more to the imperialists and avoiding confrontation with the masses. The imperialists were blackmailing the workers, shutting the banks to force them to accept the austerity and prevent them from voting no. But the Greek proletariat is well known for its courage and sacrifice. The LFI has a lot to learn from them. The blackmails by the imperialists and the bourgeoisie only drove the masses to massively reject the austerity package, saying to the imperialists to go to hell. As communists, we knew that Syriza would betray. The question was, are you going to stand at the sidelines saying, we don't have a side, calling on the workers to abstain and occupy the ports instead, like the LFI, or going with the masses within the struggle? Voting no was the only principled position, taking a stand against imperialism and use it as a weapon to push forward the struggle, exposing in the process before the masses who had illusions in Syriza every vacillation, capitulation, and betrayal of the bourgeoisie. Syriza's betrayal was a golden opportunity to push forward for a general offensive against all of its oppressors, foreign and local. That is the essence of the Anti-Imperialist United Front. The LFI's refusal to take a stand with the oppressed from Manhattan in a clear-cut question, do you accept or not the austerity measures, was a grotesque capitulation to the imperialists, like the KKE. At the same time, rejecting the United Front against imperialism, the KKE, echoed by LFI, did not advance class independence, quite the opposite. In the name of class independence from the Greek bourgeoisie, it left the mantle of anti-imperialism to Syriza, guaranteeing their continued hold on the masses. The LFI, rejecting the Leninist distinction between oppressed and oppressor nations, refused to oppose American and German imperialism, the main oppressors of Greece. This clearly shows that its struggle against imperialist oppression is, like Lenin said, a dishonest facade, such as we see in the parties of the Second International. When LFI sectarianism, you see, confronted reality, it transformed into social chauvinism. So yes, we would make an anti-imperialist united front against the imperialists with AMLO, Erdogan, Modi, and not only when there is a war, but also in peaceful times. After all, war is a continuation of policy by other means. The tasks for revolutionaries in peace and in war are essentially the same: taking a side with the oppressed, struggling to wrest leadership away from the bourgeoisie, to lead the masses to liberation from all their oppression. And if the LFI thinks, like Comrade Negrete, that class independence is guaranteed just by saying in a war, we have a military side that will give no political support, that class independence is guaranteed, then they close the eyes to the naked truth of class struggle. The only way to secure political independence of the proletarian party is to put forward an independent proletarian perspective in deeds within the struggle, not standing in the sidelines screaming for revolution. On the LFI's accusation about that of class collaboration, I will reply with a thesis on the national and colonial questions at the Second Congress of the Comintern, written by Lenin himself, and again, I challenge the LFI to condemn him. He writes, "The Communist International should arrive at temporary agreements and, yes, even establish alliance with the revolutionary movement in the colonies and backward countries. But it cannot merge with this movement. Instead, it absolutely must maintain the independent character of the proletarian movement, even its in embryonic stage." And I want to end with a beautiful quote, really beautiful quote, that captured powerfully many of the points made in this presentation. It says, In Latin America, the most powerful and dominant oppressor and exploiter is clearly Yankee imperialism. It is often the direct employers of the workers. Its IMF dictates starvation, austerity policy. The so-called national bourgeoisie is organically the lackey, the servant of the imperialists, their branch office manager at most. When this or that section of the bourgeoisie uses anti-imperialist rhetoric, it is to tighten its grip on the masses, the better to subordinate them in reality to imperialism. The dictators are usually puppets. In these senses, imperialism is the dominant, the strongest, more resourceful and stable enemy, i.e. the main enemy. I would like 30 seconds. I could not have said better, Comrade Negrete. It's from you, your letter. This is a letter you wrote in 1984, and you were smashed because you touched on fundamental problems with a program. But back then, you were thinking as a Marxist, not as a cynical, bitter, petty bourgeois history professor thinking of the past. You were thinking as a Marxist. We urge you, though, to reconsider in this light and join us.
So what we were discussing here today is how what we have called the born-again International Communist League and the Spartacist League in the United States have abandoned, renounced, denounced, and vilified one key plank after another in the revolutionary Trotskyist program that the Spartacist Tendency upheld against all manner of opportunists for 3 decades. We have explained before how the degeneration of the ICL reflected the wave of demoralization of the left set off by the counter-revolutionary destruction of the Soviet Union, undermined by decades of Stalinist bureaucratic misrule and of the bureaucratically deformed worker states of the East European Soviet bloc. With its new leadership, the ICL has now reached terminal degeneration so that it renounces the very program on which it was founded. As the ICL sank into passive propagandism, abstentionism, and ultimately betrayal of the class struggle, capitulating to the bourgeoisie's death of communism lie, those longtime cadres who were expelled in 1996 went on to found the International Group and 2 years later joined with comrades in Brazil, France, and Mexico to form the League for the Fourth International. While the IG and LFI continued to fight for the revolutionary program the Spartacist Tendency stood for, the latter-day ICL, for its part, went into a prolonged crisis which continues to this day, repeatedly changing leaderships and programmatically gyrating like a top. Beginning almost immediately after our expulsions, this latter-day ICL began revising and gutting its former program. We've already talked about the string of betrayals, abandoning Brazilian Trotskyist workers' historic 1996 struggle to oust the police from the unions, abandoning the call for Puerto Rican independence, anti-American baiting the LFI for calling for the defeat of U.S. imperialism in Afghanistan, supporting the U.S. invasion of Haiti, and that's only a small part of them. There is a common thread to all these betrayals, and it's not disorientation because of the 1992 conference document. It is capitulation to U.S. imperialism, which continues to today as they refuse to defend Russia in the face of the united imperialist proxy war over Ukraine. You claim that there has always been a unipolar imperialist world. Well, there has been at the present time, and what do? You refuse to defend the countries that are being attacked by that united imperialist offensive. I want to reiterate that because in discussing the question of permanent revolution, which is at the heart of the topic of this debate, we're not having an academic discussion. What we have here are counterposed class programs, proletarian internationalist in the case of the LFI versus bourgeois nationalist for the ICL. So Spartacus number 68 came out at the beginning of September, where the leaders of the ICL declare that the political organization that they have taken over was deformed at birth on the central question of permanent revolution supposedly because of denial of revolutionary leadership of the national liberation struggle. In their account, the Spartacus tendency was according to the Spartacus tendency, according to the new ICL, the Spartacus tendency was some kind of a thalidomide baby, a caricature of Trotskyism that betrayed at every turn. So what is Trotsky's perspective of permanent revolution? This is not just a phrase about the revolution continuing indefinitely, but a theory based on his evaluation of the class forces in the first Russian Revolution of 1905, which then became the program of the Russian October Revolution of 1917, and which Trotsky later generalized to colonial, semi-colonial, and other countries of belated capitalist development under imperialist domination. In a nutshell, and I'm quoting here, the belated capitalist development under imperialist the theory of permanent revolution, which is basic to our movement, declares that in the modern world, the bourgeois democratic revolution cannot be completed except through the victory and extension of proletarian revolution. I quote this summary because it comes from the 1963 document Toward the Rebirth of the Fourth International, the founding document of the Spartacus Tendency, which we in the LFI uphold and the reborn ICL will surely renounce sooner or later, as it is incompatible with our present distortion and negation of permanent revolution. The Spartacus Tendency was founded on the authentic program of permanent revolution and upheld it against all the pseudo-Trotskyists like Michel Pablo and Ernest Mandel, starting in the early 1950s and a decade later, joined by the leaders of the U.S. Socialist Workers' Party, who abandoned the fight for workers' revolution, led by a Bolshevik-Leninist vanguard, and instead tailed after non-proletarian forces. Today, the ICL, under new management, which pulled off what in the business world would be called a hostile takeover with the acquiescence of a demoralized Spartacist old guard, draws its arguments from the various pseudo-Trotskyists, but with an important difference. Whereas the Pavlovites, Mandelites, and so on capitulated to bourgeois and petty bourgeois nationalists and populists, this new crop of revisionists actually are nation-building nationalists masquerading in Trotskyist garb. To carry out their cynical operation, they have to resort to blatantly falsifying history. We saw this already in their 2017 Hydra document, where in the name of defending oppressed nations, they tried to present their advocacy of discriminatory anti-democratic language laws as Leninism on the national question, when Lenin emphatically said the opposite, opposing official privileging of any language, including of the oppressed. On a permanent revolution, Spartacus 68 claims that, and I'm quoting here, from 1905 to 1917, there was an essential identity between Trotsky's permanent revolution and Lenin's strategic line expressed in the formula of the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. It claims that the different formulas were only prognoses and a nuance, and that by 1917, Lenin's algebraic slogan was outlived and had to be substituted by the more arithmetic program of all power to the Soviets. In other words, no big deal. The attempt to pass this off as authentic Trotskyism is rank cynicism. Those of us who were won to Trotskyism, away from the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the peasantry and the proletariat, tactics of the social democracy and the democratic revolution, Lenin stated that his call was explicitly for a democratic, not a socialist regime, and how Trotsky in his 1939 essay, Revolution, both to Lenin's formula and that of the Mensheviks. So I suggest you can consult those sources. As for the reborn ICL's claim that Lenin's coming over to the programmatic conclusion of Trotsky's permanent revolution, namely to fight for workers' revolution, for the dictatorship of the proletariat, was just a matter of replacing an outdated prognosis, Trotsky wrote at length in his 1930 History of the Russian Revolution, in chapter 16 on rearming the party, about the tremendous struggle that took place after Lenin issued his 1917 April theses calling for all power to the Soviets. This was ferociously resisted by Kamenev, Stalin, and the other old Bolsheviks who clung to the old formula which called for completing the first stage of a bourgeois revolution. The point is, had the program of a democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry not been defeated, there would have been no October Revolution. And that's what you claim is essentially the same. So the ICL, under new management, is lying about differences between Lenin's program and Trotsky's leading up to the 1917 Russian Revolution. And when people lie about big issues, it's for a purpose. The purpose in this case is quite clear, underlined by their embrace of the call for an anti-imperialist united front, in quotes, namely, they want to make political blocs with bourgeois nationalists from the populist government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico, which they pretend is somehow anti-imperialist, when in fact AMLO is acting as a border guard for the US, both under Trump and now under Biden, to the African National Congress, which presides over the neo-apartheid regime on behalf of international capital. And they also want to make the political bloc in the name of such a so-called United Front with Tsipras and Syriza in Greece. The new crew at the helm of the ICL try to pretend that they are presenting the real deal, even when they are transparently negating Trotsky's program. Spartacus talks repeatedly of the core of permanent revolution, placing the struggle for national liberation at the center of revolutionary strategy for the neo-colonial world. In another place, it says that the experience of 1917, this is a quote, the experience of 1917 speaks to the fundamental core of permanent revolution, which is italicized, which is nothing other than the need for communist leadership of the democratic struggle, first and foremost national liberation. So the essence of the 1917 Russian October Revolution was a democratic struggle for national liberation? What garbage. For what nation? The Russian nation, the Polish nation, the Finnish nation? And the experience of 1917 was essentially a democratic struggle? Whatever happened to the proletariat taking power? The most striking case of a tendency that revised permanent revolution was that of the US Socialist Workers' Party. In late 1981, Doug Jeunesse, the editor of the SWP's newspaper, The Militant, published an article, How Lenin Saw the Russian Revolution, essentially equating permanent revolution with Lenin's RDDPP, the same sleight of hand the ICL is carrying out today. Ernest Mandel implied with the long article, stressing the difference between Lenin's formula from 1905, which foresaw the workers and peasants leading a bourgeois revolution, with Trotsky's program pointing to workers' revolution. Jeunesse responded with an even longer article in mid-1982 claiming that the October 1917 revolution was actually the RDDPP, not a workers' revolution, but a democratic revolution. And a few months later, the SWP's leader, Jack Barnes, came out against permanent revolution altogether in his speech on their Trotsky and ours. What was driving the SWP's evolution was the desire to join with Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress in South Africa as the anti-apartheid movement was heating up. And we see the same with the ICL today. Like the SWP, the new ICL wants to push to implement the ANC's Freedom Charter, which was a program for a bourgeois democratic revolution, although with some fairly radical social measures. Incidentally, the charter was written by supporters of the Stalinist South African Communist Party, whose watchword of a national democratic revolution, like Lenin's RDDPP, did not go beyond the bounds of capitalism. And when he And when the reborn ICL calls to implement the Freedom Charter, their new South African paper does. As their new South African paper does, that is in fact the position of the SACP and the ANC, whose maintenance of super exploitation of black labor was symbolized in the 2012 Marikana massacre. But where Lenin, with his formula, was fighting for revolution against the bourgeoisie, the South African CP, which you are tailing, is essentially fighting to administer that capitalist, neo-apartheid capitalist exploitation. There's much more to be said about the ICL's new anti-imperialist clothes in Mexico. It's called for a united front with the government of AMLO, and his Morena party would stand in the way of the necessary struggle to break workers from this nationalist, but in no way anti-imperialist government, which is now trying to force the so-called independent unions back into the straitjacket of corporatist state control of labor. Once again, in equating the RDDPP with permanent revolution, the ICL leaders justify this with a subterfuge, conflating Trotsky's call for independent proletarian support for the expropriation of imperialist-owned oil companies with making a political bloc with the government of Lázaro Cárdenas, which Trotsky never called for. With its vague talk of national liberation and nation building, the newborn ICL's program would be a roadblock to revolution if it had any impact, which luckily it doesn't. If anyone agreed with the line of El Internacionalista, the bourgeois name of their new paper, they would join AMLO's Morena party and push from within.
5 minutes.
So here, there, and just about everywhere, the line of the new ICL, which now repudiates just about everything that Spartacist tendency represented when it fought for the revolutionary program of Trotskyism, would have terrible consequences if carried out in the class struggle. Nowhere is this clearer than over Iran, where they denounced the Spartacist tendency's warnings against leftist support for the 1979 so-called Islamic Revolution. They take a quotation out of context to pretend that we equated Khomeini with Hitler when its point was that there can be reactionary mass movements. There were some problems with the initial formulations on Iran before we settled on the call for down with the Shah, no to the mullahs. But we told the truth about the mullah regime, where Spartacist 68 pretends that they were leading an anti-imperialist struggle. That was in fact the line of almost the entire opportunist left, from Islamic so-called Marxists to the Stalinists to pseudo-Trotskyists. And many acted on this as leftists streamed back to Tehran after spending years in exile to escape the dreaded Savak, the secret police of the US-backed dictatorship of Shah Pahlavi. But almost immediately, there were extensive arrests of leftists, followed by a wave of tens of thousands jailed in 1981, of whom hundreds, perhaps several thousand, were executed in 1988. The Stalinist Tudeh party, which had led striking oil workers into the arms of Khomeini, was rewarded by having its offices closed and its paper banned in 1979, with mass arrests of over 1,000 Tudeh members in 1982-83, with 45 of them executed as supposed Soviet spies. Because the then revolutionary Spartacist tendency was not taken in by the fool's gold of bourgeois anti-imperialism and fought for workers' revolution, we were able to warn against the impending slaughter, while the opportunists, as we wrote at the time, bowed before their executioners. And from the beginning, while politically opposing the Islamic Republic, we defended Iran against imperialist and Zionist attacks, threats, and sanctions, including calling, as we do today, for Iran's right to have nuclear weapons to deter and defend against the nuclear-armed US and Israeli warmongers. A couple of final comments. First, the new ICL leaders never knew the Spartacist tendency when it stood for genuine revolutionary Trotskyism. Not that this would make a difference, as they are deeply wedded to their nationalist politics. The latter ICL they came to had plenty of imperialist chauvinist aspects to their line, like declaring in Mexico, a U.S. semi-colony, that the main enemy is at home. This was never the position of the revolutionary ICL, and in fact, that line was cooked up to go after the internationalist group in the U.S. and the Grupo Internacionalista in Mexico. Secondly, the Spartacist Tendency and the ICL, when they stood on revolutionary Trotskyism, told the truth to the masses and fought for proletarian revolution, while the born-again ICL tries to hoodwink them with vague talk of national liberation, copied from the Stalinists, who were past masters in pushing this line in order to disguise their refusal to fight for socialist revolution. This was true from Latin America to South America and Vietnam, where almost the entire left called for national liberation, while the SL called for all Indochina must go communist. Perhaps you're going to reject that slogan as well as being sectarian. Leninists and Trotskyists...
45 seconds. Maybe.
Yeah. Leninists and Trotskyists have always been sticklers for programmatic clarity. Seemingly small differences in political formulas can have enormous consequences in the class struggle. As we said earlier, the reborn ICL has done us and the workers' movement a favor by making clear that they are not, in fact, the continuity, the heirs of the Spartacist tendency that fought for revolutionary Trotskyism. They are its antithesis. The League for the Fourth International and its national sections today represent the revolutionary political continuity of authentic Trotskyism and Leninism. We have consistently put forward programs for revolutionary internationalist struggle, from picket lines mean don't cross, to worker strikes against imperialist wars, to calling for defense of Gaza and the Palestinian Arab people, coupled with a fight for an Arab Hebrew Palestinian worker state in a socialist federation of the Middle East. The new ICL, in contrast, is putting forward one gimmick after another, many a transparent call for class collaboration, while others are just nonsensical. So when you see Spartacist on their publication, we counsel caveat emptor, buyer beware. And in conclusion, let me say, hands off Trotsky's permanent revolution.
Okay, we are now going to enter into the discussion period, and I'll start by apologizing to those who may feel disappointed and disgruntled that there's not enough time. The organizations sponsoring the event have determined that they want to hear from the organizations that spoke on the first round. So independents are, and myself included, are not going to be speaking. So apologies for that. We've had a long day. And we can begin now with the speakers from the ICL.
My name is Sean. Speaking, I'm with the Ligue Trotskyist League in Quebec in Canada. I'm a Quebecois communist, and I want to take a stand here for the basic right of the people to speak their own language, an oppressed people to speak their own language in their own country. The position of the LFI, their denunciation of our support, critical support, Quebec language laws, is essentially a reflection, a continuation of the old IS line on the national question on Quebec from the 1970s on. In a class struggle situation of historic proportion and importance for the oppressed people of Quebec in the 1960s and 70s, the International Spartacist Tendency, with your program, stood on the sideline and indeed denounced the so-called privileges of the oppressed workers of Quebec to speak French. It was a crime which left in the hands of the bourgeoisie, of the bourgeois nationalists, and the name of Trotskyism in the hands of the reformists, the Pabloites and other reformists, and abandoned the struggle of the Quebecois proletariat for what should have been a struggle for revolution. And this is with your line that this is going to keep happening. It is a crime of the IST of the time, it's a crime of the LFI, it's a crime of the rest of the left in Quebec at the time. So yes, I want to address the question of the national question in Quebec, if you noticed. Both we and the LFI now correctly call for the independence of Quebec, which is the correct starting point to address this, to take up the struggle for the leadership of the national and social liberation struggle. But indeed, the LFI denounces our defense of Law 101, the French language legislation in Quebec. For the LFI, this is a rejection of Leninism and an endorsement of chauvinist policies of the Quebecois nationalists towards minorities, but they are wrong on both counts. Marxists do reject nationalism of any kind, but Lenin also taught us that we have a very distinct approach to the nationalism of the oppressor to that of the oppressed. And Anna clearly explained the methodology of permanent revolution warrants that communists seek to compete with the nationalists for the leadership of the national liberation struggle. This is what the IG and the LFI refuse to do. And indeed, they denounce. Also, Lenin fought for an approach to the national question which is concrete. Law 101 was a law to a reform implemented during by the nationalist bourgeoisie in Quebec during the modernizing Quiet Revolution of the 60s as a defensive measure of the French language, and this is basic for Leninists to just defend this.
Speaker for the LFI.
Thank you. I'm Alberto from Grupo Internacionalista de México. The People's Front is not a tactic. It's the biggest betrayal. And the Spartacist League and the ICL have abandoned this basic understanding. A cornerstone of revolutionary Marxism with the recovery of the anti-imperialist United Front policy. Yes, as your program still says, this formula is used by Stalinists and other reformists to form political blocs with the bourgeoisie in colonial and semi-colonial countries like Mexico and many, many others. Do you want to talk about concrete? What would it imply to make a political alliance with López Obrador and Morena in Mexico today? Let's face it directly. Nowadays, there is a strike by high school teachers in Mexico City. Do you know that? Who are the bosses? The Morena government in the capital. This implies that when the teachers are demonstrating in the streets, Morena, López Obrador, and the mayor of Mexico City have a presence in the streets. And you know where? In the batons and the shields of the cops. So you are calling the Mexican workers to make a political alliance in the name of anti-imperialism with the bosses of the cops that are trying to break the teachers' strike. This is perfectly concrete. This is not words. So what should we do? What we revolutionary Marxists do in these cases? To fight against the bosses with a program of political independence, of extending the strike to other teachers' unions, but mainly to the hardcore of the Mexican proletariat.
1 minute, please.
This, I guess, is extremely important. What would imply to make this political alliance with López Obrador in Mexico, whose main political goal is to reconstruct, to rebuild the corporatist system of social control. If you say that you are going to make this alliance, you are disarming the workers in front of this bourgeois politician and his populist bourgeois party. This is not a matter of words. This is a matter of a living struggle nowadays taking place in Mexico. Which side are you on? Okay.
Okay, the other groups that I will be calling on in this order as the Bolshevik-Leninists from Australia, Bolshevik Tendency, the International Bolshevik Tendency, and the Freedom Socialist Party. So first will be the Bolshevik-Leninists from Australia.
Hello, comrades. I think the LFI charges the ICL of capitulating to the national bourgeois for a reason. They juxtapose the struggle for national liberation with proletarian revolution. This is the opposite of permanent revolution. Today, the bourgeois nationalists have a complete stranglehold over the leadership of the national liberation struggle. This completely stifles the struggle of national liberation and socialism. It is the central task for communists in the neo-colonial countries to break the working class away from such illusions. And this can only be done by championing national liberation, that we can wrest leadership away from this national bourgeois. But what does the LFI do in reaction? They reject the struggle. They see it as a capitulation to the national bourgeois. This, in fact, keeps them firmly in the hands of the proletariat, firmly in the hands of the national bourgeois. To the LFI, I ask you, do you fight for communist leadership of the national liberation movement? And if not, how do you break from the working class from such illusions as the nationalists of the bourgeois? Because if you do not do that, you cannot fight for proletarian revolution in the neo-colonies.
Speaker for the ICL.
Yes, I am Esteban from the Post-Spartakista de Mexico. I want to talk about permanent revolution from the Mexican perspective. But for that, one must understand the history of the country. Mexico lost half of its territory to the US. It has been invaded several times by the US. The IMF imposes austerity and starvation measures on Mexico. The debt is unbearable. US imperialism is the direct employer of most of the workers. NAFTA and now the USMCA have devastated Mexico, forcing millions to flee to the US, and I can keep going. It is crystal clear that the imperialist yoke determines every aspect of the political, economic, and cultural life in Mexico. The whole history of the Mexican people has been one of resistance to imperialist plunder. Thus, a struggle for national emancipation is the motor force for socialist revolution in that country. Or as Trotsky put it, the anti-imperialist struggle is key to liberation. This is why we in the HEM decided to call our new paper El Anti-Imperialista. Every IG member knows about this history, but they consciously counterpose socialist revolution to the struggle for national liberation. The IG says that our perspective, and even the name of our paper is nationalist, as Norden said. To think that it is nationalist to put struggle against imperialism at the center of our program in the main US semi-colony is simply a capitulation to US imperialism, but also to the populists by leaving them unchallenged at the head of the masses. The main obstacle now to the struggle for national and social emancipation is López Obrador, one of the most popular heads of state in the world who has sowed massive illusions that the bourgeoisie can lead some sort of a struggle or resistance against imperialist subjugation. Denying this, as the IG speakers did today, is just disarming. The only way to break the influence of bourgeois nationalism is to push forward the struggle for national liberation to its ultimate consequences, showing how the bourgeoisie betrays the fight against imperialism, exposing before the masses every vacillation and capitulation of AMLO.
1 minute, please.
The question of leadership is posed point blank. As Trotsky put it, we are in permanent competition with the national bourgeoisie as the only one leadership which is capable of assuring the victory of the masses in the fight against the foreign imperialists. Refusing to do this means leaving the anti-imperialist fight to AMLO. The IG just promotes abstract unite and fight liberal internationalism while denouncing the struggle against imperialism as nationalist. No! Proletarian internationalism between the American proletariat and the Mexican oppressed masses can only be forged through joint struggle against their common enemy, US imperialism. What about our former position on the Malvinas-Falklands War that the IG upholds? British imperialism attacked neo-colonial Argentina, and their position is to be for the defeat of both, another capitulation to imperialism. If Argentina had been victorious, that would have given a mighty impulse to the national and democratic consciousness of the country and would have led to the overthrow of the junta dictatorship. However, our defeatist position left the junta at the head of the anti-imperialist sentiment. That is the exact opposite of permanent revolution.
for the LFI.
Sharp for the LFI. I was won over to the LFI on the question of permanent revolution in South Africa. Previously, I'd been a member of the SWP and YSA. The ICL's revisions on this question parallel pseudo-Trotskyists in South Africa in the 1980s. They say that they want to implement the Freedom Charter, which they admit correctly that it's a bourgeois document, right? But they want to implement it. They want to take the place of the ANC and the EFF and lead the nation-building project. This is not permanent revolution. This is a stagist approach which will lead to and does lead to class collaboration. In the 1980s in South Africa, there was a very real prospect for proletarian revolution, and the would-be revolutionaries took the position that you are now taking today. So what we want from the LFI is political independence of the working class and to struggle against the capitalists. Permanent revolution is not about nation building. Principally, it's about solving the democratic tasks that cannot be solved under the bourgeoisie, but under the auspices of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Your literature does not say that. What it says is that you want to lead the nation-building struggle, right? It says you want to lead the nation-building struggle, and then sometime distant in the future, there will be socialism. You do mention socialism at the end. You don't mention the dictatorship of the proletariat, nor in the South African case do you mention a black-centered worker state, right? That has been jettisoned as well.
1 minute, please.
So the contemporary ICL, their position is not actually that dissimilar from elements of COSATU, the major trade union federation, and the SACP, who to this day say that they want to implement the NDR, the National Democratic Revolution, which includes the Freedom Charter. So what is your fundamental difference? There really is not one, right? There really is not. It's very difficult sort of reading your literature from the literature of the time to see any difference. And I guess I'll sum up by saying that.
Time.
No, okay. I won't sum up.
And the speaker for the Bolshevik Tendency.
Yeah, hi, Christoph from the Bolshevik Tendency. Comrades, this afternoon we have heard a lot of political name calling. And while that can be a lot of fun, I'm not going to engage in it because I only have 3 minutes. So let me focus on the essentials. In 2001, the military aggression of the US against Afghanistan was underway. And at that time, the IG raised the criticism of the SL, namely that they did not call for the defeat of imperialism, while at the same time, the SL had made it clear, of course, that they were opposed to US imperialism. So at the time, we thought the IG is involved in a bit of stick bending here, and it wasn't such a big deal. But it turned out the IG was correct in their criticism, because the response of the SL included the following. They said, quote, "There is no way to defeat the inevitable drive towards war." Well, that is perhaps abstractly true, short of socialist revolution. But what is and should be done is, of course, to mobilize against an imperialist adventure of your own ruling class. DSL advanced another excuse for their position, which was that a land invasion by the US was unlikely. So the US wasn't really all that involved in Afghanistan, which is an argument that is repeated today in regards to Ukraine, where the SL suggests the US is not really involved in the war against Russia. Wow! That's one way of bending the facts to suit your position, I'd say. So the SL actually ended up denouncing an anti-imperialist position. And I quote again, "The call for a US military defeat is, at this time, illusory and the purest hot air and revolutionary phrase-mongering," end of quote. That was the position of the SL at the time, denouncing an anti-imperialist position in regards to the war of the US against Afghanistan. So what they did in Afghanistan in terms of their politics is repeated today, where the SL refuses to call for the military victory of Russia in its fight against NATO, the combined military might of the imperialist states. The IG originally shared that neutrality position, but to their credit, they have abandoned it. That's good. I'm really happy about that. And I hope that maybe you will examine some other questions that might be re-examined with a fruitful outcome. Thank you.
The speaker for the ICL.
Hi, from the British section of the ICL. Right, I'd like to step back a little bit and comment a little bit on the discussion from the two competing groups here, as well as the presentation. So on the one hand, our comrade talked about our tasks. What are the tasks of revolutionaries when it comes to the problem of revolution in the neo-colonial countries? And that task is to fight for leadership of the national liberation struggle, of the democratic struggles, fusing them together with the socialist struggle, using them as a lever for socialist revolution. And she motivated that the strategy for the neo-colonies has to put the struggle against imperialism at the heart of the revolutionary strategy. On the other hand, Comrade Norden, you spoke, many things, but all of it was really defined by sticking to rigid formulas, reading the history of the Russian Revolution as if it was a sacred text. Let me tell you about that. That book also has a chapter on the problem of nationalities, by the way, which you apparently said was garbage. The problem of nationalities. That did play a fundamental role in the Russian Revolution. And the April thesis, it's not about the formula of what Lenin said. Sorry?
1 minute, please.
What Lenin said or what Trotsky said, but it's about what the tasks were. Both of them did share an essential identity in that they were both fighting for the proletariat to be the hegemonic force that would lead the revolution. Now, I just want to conclude by talking very quickly about the main enemies at home. You call us class collaborationist for claiming that to struggle against imperialism is class collaborationist. Now, I would just like us all to conduct a little imaginary experiment. Go to a peasant or a worker in the third world. Tell them to fight against imperialism is class collaborationist. You know what you would be doing? You would be handing them on a platter to the nationalists, thereby reinforcing the hold of the key obstacle to the fight for national liberation, to the fight for socialist revolution. And that was precisely the problem with our intervention on Iran. We denounced the mullahs, it was correct. But what about the struggle against imperialism? That was what was absent in our entire approach to Iran. What we repudiate about our intervention in Iran is not that we denounced the left. The left did play a criminal role. But we denounced the fact that we did not actually use the aspirations of the Iranian masses to struggle against imperialism to actually show that the mullahs were an obstacle to their aspirations. Is that time?
You have more time, actually.
Okay, I'm sorry. What else? The Anti-Imperialist United Front. It's like you guys don't understand what we're trying to say. Again, it's about, it's about program. Sorry, notes. Trotsky, if you seriously carefully studied our leaflet, we cite a quote from Trotsky. He said he would make a united front with the devil and his grandmother. Okay? So now, was Trotsky being class collaborationist? You decide, are you slandering Trotsky or us? I don't know. But in fact, how are you ever going to expose the nationalists if you do not engage in those united fronts in the course of the struggle, exposing their vacillation?
speaker for the LFI.
Hi, I want to speak about China because it is, number one, the major focus of U.S. imperialism, the war in Gaza and the war in Ukraine notwithstanding. And secondly, because it's such a powerful confirmation of Trotsky's permanent revolution. The events of 1925 to 1927 were decisive, not only for showing the betrayal of the attempted united front with the nationalists, but also forcing Trotsky to extend his generalization of the permanent revolution from Russia to the rest of the underdeveloped world. Now, the ICL claims to defend China as a foreign worker state, but on every key issue, which I'm going to enunciate a few of, they end up siding with the CIA. And by the way, just one further point on the anti-imperialist United Front in China. It's not like Mao didn't keep trying. You know, in the 1930s and the 1940s, he kept trying for a coalition with Chiang Kai-shek, but he wouldn't take it. But today, the ICL champions, under the guise of opposing Han chauvinism, champions the national rights of the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, and others. Guess who else is pushing that line? The CIA. The ICL denounces the brutal lockdowns with workers chained to their machines in China, which is of course a lie, and ignores the fact that China had a few thousand deaths as a result of COVID. The United States, the world's most advanced industrialized capitalist country, had more than 1 million dead. The ICL denounces the man-made islands that China is trying to establish in the South China Sea as a somehow, trampling over the national rights of countries like Korea and the Philippines. It is precisely those islands that the United States is forming a encirclement strategy around to prepare for a first strike against China. And lastly, I'll talk about the relationship with Poland. Presumably, because of the national oppression of the Polish people, communists in Poland should have blocked with Solidarność. And so I noticed that you've repudiated your position on that. And just finally, the Fourth Congress, it's been stated before by our speakers that we stand on the first four Congresses of the Communist International with reservations on the Fourth Congress. If you read the proceedings, every speaker who mentioned Islam praised it.
Time, please.
The entry into the Kuomintang was endorsed.
The speaker for the IBT.
I'm Josh Decker for the International Bolshevik Tendency. The ICL now projects, quote, national liberation as the fundamental lever for proletarian revolution, unquote, instead of Trotsky's view and the view of the IST in its revolutionary period, that class struggle under Bolshevik leadership is the motor force or the fundamental lever for socialist revolution, even in countries of belated capitalist development. They even resurrect the anti-imperialist United Front, as we've discussed, and moot the idea of the slogan of the democratic dictatorship, which Lenin himself said was outdated 107 years ago. Now, we're in basic agreement with what Comrade Norden has outlined here in his presentation. But there is a big problem in the LFI's claim to be the true heir of the revolutionary IST. We published an open letter to the ICL, to the IG, and other groups that claim the heritage of the IST. We called that open letter the baby in the bathwater. We're saying the ICL is throwing out both, but the IG is trying to keep both. What the programmatic baby is something that we very much do need to discuss in a comradely and serious way. That's urgent now in the present period of global capitalist destabilization and heightened class battles. So we're proposing a conference to talk about what the programmatic baby looks like and how to apply it today. But we also have to talk about the bathwater. The ICL actually seems to be open, although they are laughing at this. Very good. But will the LFI? So far, they have refused to offer a serious account of their own purge from the IST, the ICL at the time. But that actually matters. They claim that it was the demoralization caused by the destruction of the Soviet Union, but that can't explain why the trial of Socorro had so many parallels to the 1979 show trial of Bill Logan, or the 1981 purge of the Australian section. Doesn't explain why the SL liquidated its trade union work in the 80s. And it doesn't explain why under Comrade Norden's editorship, the Workers' Vanguard called to save the lives of US Marines when a couple hundred were blown up in 1983. We have to talk about these things.
Time, please.
Is the LFI self-confident enough to engage in that process?
If we have one more round of discussion, we are going to go over time. One more? Fine, okay. One more from the, we'll start with the ICL.
Yeah, I speak for the ICL. I'm from Socialist, South Africa. We proudly stand on radical implementation of the Freedom Charter, and the South African proletariat better lean on that program if it's to lead a struggle for national liberation and overthrow the Rand laws together with their imperialist backers. What is so objectionable about the Freedom Charter? Is it nationalization of the mines, the banks, or the general democratic questions that speak to emancipation of women, land reform? Yes, it is not our program. We proudly say that, you know. It is a bourgeois, a radical bourgeois program. You comrades act like Lenin did not carry out the SR's program on the land question, you know. Opposing nation building in neocolonial countries is nothing but a naked capitulation to imperialism. This refusal to admit that imperialist domination gives rise to national democratic tasks which the proletariat can leverage in its fight for social emancipation means counterposing for 1,000,000 times a fight for socialist revolution to national liberation. For us in South Africa, you know what that means? Dismissing a fight for black liberation. That puts you squarely in the same camp of the racist Rand lords, okay? The white ruling class. That is white domination, okay? And when you look at the actual tasks that are posed for the proletariat or the South African proletariat that confronted in the course of fighting for national liberation, you have to deal with addressing artificial colonial drawn borders that have nothing to do with the black masses. You have to deal with instituting industrial developments, for example, rolling out roads, building other means of communication to overcome, again, colonial or imperialist dictated underdevelopment. And that is nothing short of consolidating a nation, okay? Even more, consider the land question and the system of chieftaincy. These abject tools of new apartheid, loved by all manners of petty bourgeois nationalists, are an obstacle to expropriation of land without compensation. You know, they prevent black women from inheriting lands of their deceased husbands on the pretext of tradition. Do you seriously think that these tools can be expropriated and swept aside without challenging and competing with the nationalist forces for the leadership of the national liberation struggle by putting forward a revolutionary-centered proletarian strategy to fight imperialism? Obviously not. Trotsky wrote to his South African comrades in the 1930s, imploring them that through proletarian methods, boldly take the solution of the national problem in your hands. It cannot be otherwise. the historical weapon of the national liberation struggle is only class struggle. That's what our masthead says.
Time, please. The speaker for the LFI.
So the ICL wants to lecture us on the struggle against imperialism. Are you kidding, comrades? For 28 years, the ICL refused to advocate independence for Puerto Rico. In 2009, starting with the French section and the whole ICL, they refused to advocate independence for the French colonies of Guadeloupe and Saint Martinique. And now, today, they are still for statehood for Puerto Rico if the people want it. No. Communists are against imperialist annexation. The ICL, no. In 2010, they supported the invasion of Haiti by the US Marines to lord it over the black population. The ICL in Europe denounces all those who oppose the Dublin III deportation law as bourgeois liberals. This deportation law is used to deport refugees who have made it to Northern Europe back to their country of entry in Europe, usually Greece or Italy, where they're incarcerated and sent back to their country of origin, and many times finish up in the prison hellholes of Libya. And anybody who is against this, according to the ICL, is a bourgeois liberal. They denounce the call to let refugees in. At the same time in Britain, the ICL howled along with the anti-immigrant right, demanding Brexit now. The campaign for Brexit was a chauvinist circus with the anti-immigrant right screaming for keeping Poles and other immigrants out of Britain.
1 minute, please.
Racist attacks significantly increased during this xenophobic campaign. We of the LFI abstained on the vote while calling for mobilizing the working class in defense of immigrants, refugees, and minorities. Lastly, the ICL refuses to defend self-rule in southeastern Ukraine or support the express will of the people in Donbas to be part of Russia as a basic defense against ethnic cleansing, where they've murdered 15,000. Why did they do this? Because they refused to defend the target of US imperialism, Russia, and so they turn their back on the ethnic cleansing of people just because they speak Russian.
Time. And now the speaker from the Freedom Socialist Party.
First of all, I'm Stephen Durham from the Freedom Socialist Party. Regarding Mexico, from our perspective here in the United States in collaboration with Mexican comrades, we agree with the League for Fourth International around AMLO. The permanent revolution has three different concepts. The first is that in this epoch, only revolutionary leadership can meet the needs of the working class, and that's where the party comes in. And the second point is internationalism. And as Trotsky said, so the future of socialism will be concluded or defined in the international arena. And the third one is the permanent aspect of it. And it's our view in the Freedom Socialist Party that this is critical, that you see women and people of color moving forward in this time, given the retardation of the socialist revolution, and that brings us to socialist feminism, and also the black struggle, which is that revolutionary integration was written as a critique of the SWP when the question of black liberation was really on the agenda within the heartland of US imperialism, and that was the last great revolutionary upsurge, although there have been others. So it's that third aspect that's so important. That's why we're socialists and we're feminists, and that's how we explain the revolutionary dynamic of women moving out. And we in the Freedom Socialist Party, along with our organization, the Radical Women, which is an autonomous women's organization, we both don't accept the bourgeois leadership within the women's movement, but we say that we're socialist feminists and that the Bolsheviks themselves were, and many of the tasks that were posed by the Russian Revolution at the time then were not completed by Stalin, and then there was, in the social arena, there was complete regression. And we see it happening in Argentina, in the United States, in Ireland, and other places where women and people of color are moving forward. Please. And that is, that's what I wanted to share with you. And it's been, I'm really happy I was here, and I look forward to talking to you or working with you in the different arenas where we encounter each other. Thank you. And I hope that when you come to our forums, maybe the Spartacist League will be very respectful in your comments rather than denouncing us as being pseudo-Trotskyists. That is not productive for building our movement. Thank you.
Okay, it's time to close off this session and the day. The summary by the LFI. We'll proceed now for 6 minutes and 15 seconds.
There's a lot to say, and I don't have enough time. So I do want to answer on the question of Greece. The struggle in Greece is not for national liberation, it's for international socialist revolution together with all the countries in Europe. The Greek Civil War was fought on the program of national liberation by the Stalinists when it should have been a struggle for international communist revolution, and that program, together with the Stalinists, prevented the struggle for Balkan Socialist Federation at the time. There is no separate national bourgeoisie or comprador bourgeoisie in Greece. Greece is a sub-imperialist power. It controls much of the world's shipping. It is a banking presence in Eastern Europe. And Alex Tsipras proved that there is no separation between the national bourgeoisie and the other bourgeoisies of the imperialist European Union. On the referendum, it was known beforehand, it was perfectly obvious that this was a maneuver by Tsipras to get a no vote, to bargain with the bankers, after which he would capitulate to them. We called for abstention because this was a ploy, this was a fraud, and you participated in that fraud. We did not just call for abstention, we called for workers' action, for occupying the ports, for occupying the hospitals, for shutting down the railroads. That is workers' action against the imperialist oppression of the Greek working people and all Greek people through their austerity program. What you did is you tailed after the bourgeois nationalists. Secondly, on the communist someone asked about the communist leadership of the National Liberation Movement. We call for socialist revolution to resolve the national oppression and imperialist stranglehold. To pretend that you can have national liberation without socialist revolution is a fraud and a lie that you're hoodwinking people with. Speaker from the ICL British section said, how can you expose the nationalists if you don't engage in United Fronts? We intervene in the struggles against imperialist domination to expose the nationalists. On the IBT's proposal for some kind of a conference, I would say simply There is no family of Spartacism any more than there is a family of Trotskyism or a family of the left, and you're not going to build a revolutionary party by a Spartacist family reunion, but only by the intransigent struggle for the program that the Spartacist Tendency was founded on, which the ICL has now renounced, and which the two branches of the BT and IBT fled from at the start of the second anti-Soviet Cold War. In terms of the comparison of the trial of Socorro with the trial of Bill Logan was guilty as charged. Socorro was persecuted. And on Malvinas, the support of the Argentine nationalist left to the military adventure of the generals is what sank the possibility of workers' revolution in Argentina. There was a burgeoning workers' movement at that time. The generals called for their adventure in order to head it off. The left bought it, and then when it was defeated, there was a wave of defeatism seized Argentina, and it was because the left supported that war, it was the bourgeoisie that profited from the fall of the junta.
So the ICL speaker for 6 minutes and 38 seconds.
First of all, I thought, Comrade Norden, in your presentation, you said it will not be an academic debate, but actually, you didn't weigh any way forward. I would like to say something. In Results and Prospects, Trotsky wrote that Marxism is above all method of analysis, not analysis of texts, but analysis of social relations. Your presentation, the majority of it, it was basically an analysis of texts, of text really, material reality and how to prove that you're not based on a material reality. You think that Greece is an imperialist country. I'm sorry I'm going to say that, but if you actually think with the key events that are put, it's not all the history of Greece, that Greece is not oppressed by imperialism and actually rules the world together with the US bourgeoisie, then really you need to drop off politics or go with the Communist Party of Greece, but I suggest you do the first. It's incredible. About Mexico, you should read Trotsky actually on Mexico, how he says, he says the revolutionary struggle of Mexico is really to compete with the national bourgeoisie. That's what it says about Mexico. And you should read and actually defend the nationalizations and Cardenas against the imperialists. And actually, I have a quote here about Mexico and Latin America, and it says, the article is, anti-imperialism is the key to, the imperialist struggle is the key to liberation. It is clear to me, at any rate, that the internal tasks of these countries cannot be resolved without a simultaneous revolutionary struggle against imperialism. Condemn him. Condemn him. About the anti-imperialist united front is only against the imperialism, comrade, is not about the workers, to expose them. To expose them. About the referendum is a very socialist position, but I'll explain what my presentation did, what yours did. My presentation is really Marxist, based on social relations. It gave the material basis of all the oppression, showed the picture of the country, then shows how the proletariat struggles reflect that oppression. This is the motor force for revolution. And the civil war in Greece, that's what happened, but was under the false leadership. Class collaborationists and the Greek Trotskyists, in reaction to that, they rejected it. They rejected take a side against the British. They rejected take a side against the Wehrmacht. And they left the anti-imperialist struggle to the Stalinists and to the national bourgeoisie. And we're starting here because of that now, without a socialist revolution in Greece. So what's your answer? How you break the nationalism from the masses? Nothing today, nothing. How are you gonna actually make a revolution in Greece? How? Nothing on that issue, nothing. Because your material reality is not material reality. It's just ideas, some text from Trotsky, some text from Lenin, and some blah, blah, blah. Let's actually criticize some of the people, you know? But let me tell you why materialist reality is very important. Okay, you need to draw your tasks. How the bloody are you gonna draw your tasks? I'll give you an example. Everybody here goes to work every day, I think. Right? Okay, so before they go to work, they open their window and they see, is it raining or is it sunny? You know, should I put my boots on? Should I have an umbrella, or should I put glasses? You know, sunglasses. It's very simple as that, how you draw your tasks as revolutionaries. And then in my presentation, after the struggles of the proletariat, you see, and it flows like a bloody river of Marxism, which says that the national bourgeoisie is the enemy to defeat, is the force to defeat, but the main enemy is imperialism. And for that reason, because you cannot understand the material reality of combined and Avinian development, is a jingle for you, blah, blah, blah. You cannot understand this, that determines the role of the bourgeoisie and how the illusions spread because of that exactly. What you reject is the leadership of the anti-imperialist struggle. And I tell you what, why? Because you don't believe it's really the roots of opportunism. Because the masses, you believe that the masses cannot break with the nationalism under a communist leadership, and shows how you underestimate the masses and the strength of the proletarian vanguard. And it shows insecurity about your own program because you don't know how to make a revolution in the neo-colonies. All shades of opportunism are, in the last analysis, reducible to an incorrect evaluation of the revolutionary forces and potential of the proletariat. This is Trotsky. The road, and that's mine, the road of refusing to struggle against imperial subjugation is the road to the Second International. And I tell you what's the outcome of that. The main goal of communism, what it is, comrades? World revolution, okay? Rejecting to champion the national liberation struggle is a betrayal of that principle. If the proletariat of the West refuses to support the colonies to emancipate from imperialism, then there is no talk of workers' revolution. It means that we'll remain slaves, mere objects, and condemn the Comintern for that. Mere objects under the great masters. And in the imperialist centers, the workers will beware the chains of social chauvinism. It will strengthen their bondage. So no workers' revolution there either. It's the road to catastrophe for human civilization. That's actually the consequences of your position. And whatever, you know, little things you say about the past, Comrade Norde, I respect your history and everything, but what you put forward today, there is nothing. How? How you break the nationalism? How do you say to workers to break nationalism? How you do a revolution? What is the material reality? The workers in Greece, they have suffered centuries of that. Centuries. That's it.